Done a couple of these Sony versus Canon videos now, and I know that's an original idea. It's never been done on YouTube before, a Sony versus Canon. And I've kind of left it up in the air as far as my conclusions go on most of these videos. Now, the funny thing about this is I've been a Sony shooter for many years, went to get into Canon because I had been building an RF lens collection while shooting on the Red Komodo, and wanted to simplify my system into one ecosystem. Now, when I first started using the Canon bodies, I wasn't very good at it. And I wasn't very good at it at the time, I thought, because the R5 and the R5C for what I do, and I'm a full-time real estate photographer, videographer, media creator, also do some video production. I thought that for what I do, these were not as usable as the Sony cameras. But what I found was when you start working with these Canon cameras, within their limitations, they are really, really close. And so let me get into first, before we start with why it's advantageous to choose Sony over Canon, and why my decision to go to a completely Canon ecosystem may not be best for everybody. Because Sony does make a lot of sense over Canon in some ways. First, though, we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is for most types of commercial photography, real estate included, it really makes no difference which one of these systems you use. You just have to be proficient at using the system. I can show you a bunch of images that were taken with 5 or 6 different cameras, some of them being Canons, some of them being Sonys. And what you'll see is, especially with interior composites, it's little as makes no difference. The resolution actually makes more difference than anything else. That makes a difference than the lens that's on the front of it or the name that's stamped on the camera itself, because the resolution sometimes is going to be your barrier to how malleable those files are in different ways. So that's first. You know, all of these cameras are certainly capable of producing professional results. Now, having said that, the Sonys are better at a couple things. The Sonys, and this is what you're giving up going from Sony to Canon, are on balance better at focusing. Full stop. Okay, I am absolutely 100% camera agnostic. I don't care what name is stamped on the camera. I'm not a fanboy of one or the other. I like shooting on Red, I like shooting on Blackmagic and Sony and Canon, and I would love to get my hands on a Fuji and see what that's all about. Actually had one briefly at one point. But Sony just has a better focusing system. It's different in the Canon bodies. The Canon bodies are more tailorable, so they have the different cases and there's more things you can set up within the Canon focusing system to make it work for your specific use case that you're shooting. But in my experience, and granted I don't have any experience with the R3, nor do I with the R6 Mark II, and those are the Canon bodies that allegedly have the best focusing autofocus systems to date in Canon land. But the A1 is just nuts. And the crazy thing about the A1 and its focusing system is that in true Sony form has trickled down from the A1. The A7 IV is also pretty nuts. Its focusing system is great in the A7 IV. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It's sticky, it's reliable, it's more sticky and more reliable than either of these cameras are. And the A7R5, same kind of thing. It's a lesser camera price-wise anyway to the Sony A1, but the focusing, you know, and it has the AI focus thing. So the Sonys they just work better for focusing. That's the one thing that Sonys do better. The second thing that Sonys do better is the Sony files are more malleable, especially in highlight retention and recovery, than the Canon files are. And this is something that I really noticed when I was pairing the two systems side by side, the Sony A1 and the Canon R5, and that is that the A1 is a 50 megapixel sensor, the R5 and R5C are 45 megapixel sensors, and so you would think, being that it's a very small difference in resolution, that the file sizes will be very similar as well, but they aren't. The Sonys are about twice as heavy as the Canons. So the 50 megapixel Sony A1 files are about 100 megabytes a piece for the 50 megapixel RAWs, uncompressed RAWs, whereas the Canon's about half that. It's about 1 megabyte per megapixel, or about 50 megabytes a piece. Now, at first I thought, well, I mean, maybe that just means the Canon file is more efficient. You know, you're getting the resolution, you're getting the bit depth and the color and everything, but in a more efficient package, just with however that file works. But really, the things about the file that are not dependent on the sensor. And so noise performance is often depending on the sensor, right? And I do like the Canon noise performance better than the Sony's too, by the way. But things that are not dependent on the sensor. So the malleability of the file itself, how that data is encoded, and then how programs like the Adobe Suite decodes that data in the post process. I found that with Sony, and especially with highlights, you can recover more of that detail than with the Canons. And so I'll give you a for instance, and then we'll move on. When I'm shooting real estate and I'm shooting exteriors for real estate, the way that I like to do that is I'll be on aperture priority. I will have single point focus typically. With the A1, I could use a tracking box because I could trust it. With the Canons, I can't, it jumps too much. And so I'll have single point focus, and so I'll, you know, focus, reframe kind of thing. Aperture priority, I'll have my ISO set at 100, and then I will, using my exposure compensation dial on the back here, shoot one stop under. My metering, by the way, is like an evaluative kind of metering. And why do I do that? Well, I do that because all the cameras these days are very good, very, very good at shadow recovery. But what I don't want to do is exceed the point of no return on the highlights, which when you're shooting real estate outside is typically the sky. Because if you blow a sky, it's gone, right? You go to pull it down in post and it's just kind of grayscale. Now, regardless of the difference in metering, and so this is another thing the A1 is just better at. The Sony cameras, and not just the A1, but the A7 IV, A7R5, A7R4, all those, I'm less likely to blow a sky if the evaluative metering of the rest of the frame is taken to be one stop under, as was defined by my exposure compensation. I'm less likely to blow a sky. With the Canons, I have to give a little bit more leeway there. So I will ride my exposure compensation dial and go between 1 and 2 stops under, depending on what the rest of my scene is. So depending on if I'm like under trees and it's bright, sunshiny out, then I might go to 2 stops under, or else the evaluative metering will still have the sky be too bright and I'll lose it. And the thing with the Sonys, that's not so much of a problem because you can recover those stops of highlights. With the Canons, you really can't. Now, what's interesting about this is I've seen talking head YouTube stuff with YouTubers that will go out and take these cameras and, you know, point them at flowers and pretty girls and stuff, and, you know, and try to do like a head-to-head. But the real world and actually working with these things is a little bit different than that. So I touched a little bit on the reasons that I wanted to go to the Canons, or at least look into going to the Canons anyway. and that is to use the same set of lenses that I was using on the Red Komodo. The other thing, though, is you'll see in front of me I have a pair of R5C Bodies, and the way that I use these is I will use one of them, the one that has the battery grip on it, for my stills work, and then I will use the other one that does not have a battery grip for my video work. And this one is typically rigged to the moon because you have to do that with the R5C. The battery life's horrendous, and you can't wirelessly tether and, and all this other stuff, right? So you need monitors and batteries and all that stuff with it to really work with it, in any kind of professional way. And so I didn't want to have to be building and taking apart, these things. Plus, I like having backups of everything. Now, my point with this is, with the R5C, it's such a good stills camera and it's such a good video camera, all rolled into one, that I can have one for stills and one for video and have them be each other's backup. And that's something I never found with Sony. So my most recent Sony Loadout would be 3 bodies. I would have the Alpha 1 for stills. I would have the A7S III for video, because the A1 is a better stills camera. The A7S III is a better video camera than the A1 is. And I would have the A7 IV as a backup, though not a really great backup for a video camera. See, you couldn't do what you did here with Sony because they don't have any one super complete hybrid camera like the R5C is. This is a 45 megapixel stills camera that shoots 8K 60 RAW. Sony just doesn't have that within their lineup. Maybe they will at some point. Heck, maybe Canon will have a camera that competes with the Alpha 1 once they get around to actually releasing the R1, right? But right now, Sony doesn't have that camera. So by going to Canon and by learning how to use the R5C to its capacity, I have simplified my loadout to where now I have one set of lenses. So I could shoot on red if I wanted to at R5C and only have one set of lenses. Beyond that, having 2 of the same bodies, I can have, like I said, one for stills, one for video. They be each other's backups. Or I could have 2 of the exact same body to do multicam video work. And that's huge too. Not having to try to match the looks of different cameras with different sensors, even from the same manufacturer, to each other. That's really handy to have. So it shrinks my whole loadout. And as far as being able to work with it, like the Sonys, I've had a lot of different opinions in the past about how the Sony Imaging Edge app is better than the Canon Control app. And I still think that's true. But Sony has, since I've said all that, gone to a different app than Imaging Edge. It's some kind of media share thing, whatever they're doing. And one of the things that they did, and this is very destructive to workflows, is you need a separate touch. You need a separate button click to even bring up to modify values. And that may not seem like a big deal to some people, but if you're using these things as part of a workflow and you're doing like what I do, I shoot hundreds of houses per year. It starts to every single little click, and there are Silicon Valley geeks that with user interface, user experience, I mean, they like dive down on this stuff. Like, we need to make as few swipes and as few clicks as possible to have a great user experience. And Sony went backwards on that with their newest iteration of the software. Plus, one of my big complaints with the Canon as far as the Canon Connect app was that I could not work with it as quickly as the Sony app because it took longer for the image to transmit from the camera to the iPad that I'm tethering on. And during that time of image transmission of the one that I just took coming over, I could not modify any of my values. And so I had to wait for that image to come over before I could modify my... So if I'm doing a bracket and I wanted to do one stop, whatever, I couldn't do that until that image comes over for me to preview. Now, I found a hack to that, actually. The hack to that is F11. For some reason, when you go between however fast your lens is and F10, it takes considerably longer for your image to come over. But then as soon as you exceed F10 and go to F11, from F11 and smaller apertures than that, it comes instantly over. And so that actually enables me to work quicker than with the Sony cameras. Now for interiors, that's okay because we typically want most things to be in focus anyway. And so shooting at F11, okay, now we can get into the nerdier conversation of a 45 megapixel sensor and where's diffraction kick in and all that, but it doesn't matter. Not for real estate on the daily. Okay, what matters is I'm on a tripod, so it doesn't matter, my shutter speed can be whatever it is because I'm stabilized, right? Shoot F11, it comes right over. Now I'm actually able to work quicker with the Canon Connect app than I can with the Sony app. So the way that I work just as quickly with the Canon cameras as I did the Sonys, because like I said in the beginning of this video, all of these produce results that are near as makes no difference to each other. But the way that I work with the Canon as quickly as the Sonys now is I shoot my composites on F11 often, unless I'm doing something very specific. And I am using the single point focus and then focus recomposing versus with the A1, I could just stick a tracking box on something and do it like that. That is a better system, but this is nearly as fast, so it doesn't really make a difference. And I protect the highlights a little bit better because the Canons actually do look a little bit better in the shadows. I've always thought that. Just the grain of the noise is a bit more pleasing than the Sony shadows, where it's chroma noise in the Sony, so there's big color blotches and stuff, and the Canon noise just kind of looks more like a grain. So I shoot a little bit more under with the cam, a little bit more underexposed with the single exposure stuff with the Canons than I do with the Sonys, because you have to protect those highlights. They're not coming back, so they're not as good as the Sonys. And then the final thing with the Canon versus the Sony is the ecosystem itself. Okay, so we've done a lot of talking about the different bodies, the R5C, the R5 versus the A1, the A7 IV. Now, these are all transient, right? The bodies come out a lot more often than do the lenses, then do the batteries, then does the media cards, then does all this other stuff. So when you're looking to buy into a system or you're looking to switch systems that you have bought into that you're going to be using professionally, all that other stuff really matters. And the one thing that I like better about the Canon system versus the Sony system that really matters is how many of Canon's lenses are optically stabilized. They have stabilization within the lens. Now, in fairness, this could be a workaround for Canon never really figuring out how to do sensor stabilization as good as Sony. Everybody knows about the wide-angle wobble thing with Canon. But they've made some extraordinary lenses with these RF lenses, and they have stabilization right in the lens. And especially with a camera like the R5C where it has a pinned sensor in it. So I've got a 50 on this one right now. But so my typical loadout for photo and video and everything is the 15 to 35 2.8L, which is this one. And then the 24 to 105 f4L. Both of those lenses are optically stabilized. And so on a body like an R5C that has a pinned sensor, that's nice because you don't have to worry about not only the Canon wobbles, but just even with Sony, it just behaves kind of strangely sometimes, so if you start and stop motion, especially if you're on a gimbal, it can maybe just juke a little bit on you, so I found that I enjoy the Canon implementation of having stabilized lenses more than the Sony implementation of just really relying on the sensor stabilization. And the final thing that I want to mention that I kind of touched on a little bit before is exploring the ceiling of capability of these cameras and how that's different one from another. And by that I mean, before I started doing photography professionally, when I was just learning photography many years ago, I had a couple Nikon crop bodies. The most recent of which, before I started buying Sony full-frame bodies, was the Canon D7200, which I still think is a fantastic camera. I really like the Nikon cameras. But I had the Nikon crop bodies. I was not using them to their capacity or to their limits. And it's not because the cameras were bad. It's because I didn't know what I didn't know. I wasn't good enough or experienced enough at this to know how to use those cameras to their limit and to even really explore what those limits are. But the more that you learn and the more that you grow in photography, the more your skill set is going to be able to explore those limits. The more tricks, the more experience you have up your sleeve means that when you hit those limits, you're going to be able to know how to push and pull it. Like, for instance, the highlight thing with the Canons and the exposure compensation. Now, I wouldn't have really known what I was doing back in my Nikon crop body days to know how best to tune the metering, the exposure compensation, working with the files in post. I mean, all of that makes difference, right? ISO values, you know, and sensor sensitivity, all of that makes difference with that. I wouldn't have known as much how to deal with that particular thing, or even been able to identify that the Sony cameras are a little bit better in that regard for whichever way, in this case it's the malleability of the files in post, than the Canon cameras. And so what I mean is this. The Canon R5C, now that I'm very familiar with this camera, this is what I'm choosing to go forward with at this time for nearly all of my professional work. And a big reason for this is the ceiling of capabilities that this camera is capable of, once you realize how to use it, is higher than any other hybrid camera that I know of. And that's just a fact. And I've had about a year of testing them back and forth to be able to say that with authority now. It just is. It just is, so that's the one that I'm keeping. So this is my last Sony versus Canon video. I hope you enjoyed it. It wasn't scripted, and so I know that it's just rambling. In retrospect, you probably should have watched it at 2 times speed, but hey, here you are. Please like this video. It really helps the channel grow. I know I've been absent lately. It's my busy season. So the other thing that I had been doing is making a bunch of videos about how real estate photography will be different in 2023 because we had quite a market correction happening. Well, that has seemed to resolve itself here this spring. However, I am taking some pretty big financial business steps to prepare myself for if we have another fall off this year. So this is now coming into the end of June, and this is typically when real estate starts to kind of slow down from the spring selling season anyway. And we'll see how it goes. But I've made some big changes, and so I've got a video coming about that too. Please like and subscribe. I'll see you again soon. Peace.